I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. For most of us, the trials and tribulations of corporation boards of directors may seem comparatively of little concern. Let them eat cake, one might even note. Except for the fact that in American life today, corporations do loom so large, so high and mighty, and their governance, corporate governance, must indeed command our attention, our concern. That's why I was so interested when the Wall Street Journal some time back printed a very much to the point article on corporate governance, offering some quite timely suggestions for streamlining and making much more effective the important jobs done by members of corporate boards. The very people who play such a crucial and responsible role in the business life of America today. Lester Korn wrote that Wall Street Journal article. The chairman and chief executive of Korn Ferry International, the key executive search firm in the United States. He's a member of the board of directors of 3 publicly owned companies and ultimately helped search out the members of a great many more. Lester Korn, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Dick. It's good to see you again.
You know, reading the Wall Street Journal piece again, I couldn't help but feel that when you wrote that there is a shortage of potential directors with the stature, the experience and expertise that boards seek, I couldn't help but wonder whether that didn't mean that we should indeed move away from the philosophical underpinnings that produce boards of directors. If we can't get the right people, why put that power and responsibility in their hands?
Well, I would say that what you say has considerable merit, Dick. I think that, first of all, there is a shortage of qualified directors. There's no shortage of people who would like to be directors or feel that they are qualified, but in the eyes of the people who are choosing board members, existing board directors and CEOs, there is a shortage. Now, I think one of the problems is that boards have gotten too large in the United States. If you go back even to the turn of this century, boards were ceremonial and honorary types of organizations. Through the 1920s, that's the way it remained. Commencing with the Great Depression and forward, a significant additional amount of responsibilities have been placed upon boards, and more so in the last 5 years than any time in the history of our nation, so that today directors have a much higher degree of responsibility. One of the ways of solving the shortage problem is to shrink the size of boards, which now average 13, and may be too cumbersome, in fact. And another way is, of course, to broaden the capabilities of the people so that they are qualified to serve on boards.
You mean schools for directors?
Yes, I think not quite a public school, if you will, but I think that many small companies would benefit by adding to their boards the number 2, 3, 4 person in a larger corporation. And they would probably want the president of that company, and they probably couldn't get the president of that company to serve. So they should seek out the number 2 or 3 or 4 ranking person to serve. And as that person gains experience on a board, obviously more and more experience will, of course, produce more and more qualified directors.
Do you think it's made a lot of sense to move outside of a corporation for the board members, or for a larger and larger percentage of the board members?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that was wrong with boards of directors is that they were too inbred. And, you know, it's difficult enough to speak up to a chief executive officer and say you are wrong to the chief executive officer. Now, there are nice ways of saying it, but boards of directors who are independent and have their wherewithal coming from other than the company itself are certainly going to speak up. Inside directors are employees of both the company and the chief executive officer. Outside directors are not employees of the chief executive director.
What would disturb you about the formulation? It is difficult to find the right kinds of people. The responsibilities and powers of boards have grown. Let's move back. Let's turn the hands of the clock back and say that the professional people run a corporation, let them run it, and let them take the responsibility.
Well, I think that the problem is that you have a body of shareholders who need a monitoring device. Just as in the government, we have to have a balancing system. I think corporate America, in fact, needs to have a balancing system. The CEO has to report to somebody. His ultimate is the shareholder of the company. But the shareholders only meet once a year, and they are only allowed to vote on a very limited amount of things. And I think that checks and balance system is a very desirable thing. An outside board is, in fact, ultimately responsible for the financial results and profitability of the corporation, the protection of its assets, both human and financial, and, of course, the management succession of a company. And so they have a due diligence role to play. And I think if you had all insiders on a board, as was possible up until just a very few years ago, and as you know, is still very much the mode in many industrialized countries around the world, you don't have that checks and balances. The shareholders are better protected, and I must say, many corporations that are private have outside directors for the very reason. Really competent chief executive officers like having a vigorous board because it helps them to formulate their thinking.
You use the phrase due diligence. That seems to me to be the beginning of a statement of legal responsibility, is it?
Oh, absolutely. The SEC has come very close to defining, not totally, but defining heavy responsibilities for directors. Clearly, there is a monitoring function. Directors, if they do not perform certain duties and do not maintain a certain due diligence or a form of vigilance, are personally responsible. They're going to get sued. They get sued anyhow. The dangers would be substantial to a director who did not perform his monitoring function, which, of course, is the review of the activities of the corporation.
Are there many instances in which the legal liability of the directors is tested?
Oh, yes, there are many that are tested. There are very few, other than in cases that have involved fraud or a criminal action of some sort, that, in fact, directors have been found to be negligent. Directors, by and large, are very conscientious, work very hard, and get paid not enough money for what they do, in fact. And
what do you mean, not enough money?
Well, the average director in the United States makes about $18,000 for about 100 hours of work a year. And that is also far less than he makes in his normal work. And there are many, in fact, that article you were referring to in the Wall Street Journal, which outlined some of my thoughts. I had a call from a friend of mine, Bill Simon, the former Secretary of the Treasury, after he had a chance to read it, and he wanted to tell me what he thought about the article, and he was very kind about it. He said he had one point that he disagreed with, and that was that I wasn't strong enough on calling for higher compensation for directors, for outside directors. And in the article, as I recall, I suggested that the average should move 25 to 35. And his point to me, and I agree with it, is that you have to make it worthwhile for directors to want to serve, or you're not going to be able to attract the right directors. And I have to agree with him, by the way. I think it should be higher.
In reality, whether they're highly enough paid or not, are directors, by and large, truly whistleblowers? I mean, if you were to look at the major corporations of America, do we have the power and responsibility exercised appropriately?
Yes, my judgment is that it is exercised appropriately. I think that it is exercised far more behind the scenes, so people don't realize it. But there is no question that the formation of the nominating committee system in the last 3 or 4 years has had a major impact on boards of directors. The nominating committee is basically a group of directors who, at the request of the chief executive officer, screen candidates for vacancies on boards. That is as an important a development as was the formation of the audit committee at the board level about 5 or 8 years ago. And directors today have far more power, work far more to make sure that plans are being met, that the assets are being safeguarded, and that, quite frankly, there is a management succession plan in place, and that the company is doing strategic planning.
Lester, you know, decades ago when I was going to school...
I was right there with you, so...
No, I mean decades ago. I remember back in the radical 30s, there were those who were complaining bitterly about interlocking directorates, who were complaining bitterly about the stranglehold they maintained that a comparatively few people, a small handful of people, had upon the major corporations in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you were to look at the big corporations, would you find the same people sitting on the boards of the big ones?
No, but you would still find interrelationships. You would not find what you found in the 20s or even in the 30s, but you would certainly find the large banks represented on the large corporations and vice versa, and you would find, and that's good because they understand each other's businesses, but you would not find the dominance of control that you used to find. They'd be one of 13 as opposed to one of one as far as outside directors are concerned.
In reading some of the materials that your company has produced on the question of boards, I gather that there has been a new interest in academics.
Oh, yes, that's correct.
And that on the assumption that academics are more independent, less independent, which?
I think the renewal of interest is twofold. It's a recognition that they are independent and there's a body of people. If there is a shortage of directors from the corporate world, you have to go someplace else other than the corporate world. And the two areas that have benefited from that are former government officials and members of academia. And I think that when you go into the academic world for directors, you frequently not only pick up a judgmental factor, but you may very well pick up a technical skill. I can recall a few years back, one of the very large banks asked us to find a director with strong real estate capability to serve on that board, and that person ended up being an academician who understood urban development very well. Why did that bank want a real estate background? Because they were dealing constantly with real estate problems or opportunities, actually, and no other director on that board had that capability. A few years back, one of the largest oil companies wanted a geologist on the board because for the same reason. They had an extraordinarily competent board, but there wasn't an outside balance to the inside explanation of the geological reports. So frequently when you go to academia, you will go after not only a broad business capability that exists, but very frequently a specific skill. Government officials, of course, have come on because of the ever-increasing need to do business with not only the American government, but internationally.
Besides the specific skills, what are the qualities that you look for in trying to identify potential directors?
Well, to begin with, corporations generally have pretty strong opinions on what they want. In other words, when I go out to visit with the chairman of a board of a company or one of my partners do, and they are asked to find a director, they will frequently say, we want a director with these types of skills. We want this person to be a chief executive officer or president or whatever that area of the business world is from. We want them perhaps from a certain industry. And so they will, in fact, help define the pattern. Now, once we've outlined the pattern of what we want, then it's up to us to begin to, and it's very confidential work, it's up to my partners and to me to decide who should get the call, and that takes a great deal of homework. One of the major oil companies, really splendidly managed oil company, Getty Oil, asked us to assist them not too long ago, and they were very interested in having a senior marketing, senior profit and loss chief executive officer and on their board. And we worked with them very closely and approached David Mitchell over at Avon, the chairman and chief executive of Avon, and determined his level of interest, which was strong. Put Mr. Mitchell together with the members of the Getty board, and of course with the president, Mr. Peterson, and Mr. Mitchell ended up accepting going on that board. Now, the board of Getty knew what it wanted. It itself had defined what type of person and what type of skills they wanted on the board to better help the board and Sidney Peterson manage the affairs of Getty Oil.
You say what kind of person and what kinds of skills, but I have the feeling you're talking about training, you're talking about interests, and I was wondering whether there are personal qualities.
Oh, yes.
And what they are.
A board member has to get along with the chief executive officer. It's a very close relationship. A board member has to be sympathetic to the chief executive officer, and in fact, he almost should really like the chief executive officer, because there are going to be moments of considerable heat at the board meetings, and they have to be done without confrontation coming about. You have to make decisions at the board level without confrontation, but by the same token, you still have to attack the problems of the company and safeguard the interests of the shareholders. So consequently, the personal characteristics are very, very important. Not only the style has to be compatible, but more importantly, the outside director must be willing to invest the time to learn about the company, to identify with it, and to understand why he's being asked to come on the board. You know, it's not an honor anymore. It's still a great honor to go on the board of a major corporation, but the honor is far less than the potential problems you're going to have, and certainly far less than the money you're going to earn as a result of putting in all that time. By the way, no one serves as a director for money. It's just that if it has been my feeling for some time, and by the way, Rod Hills, the former SEC chairman, who is a friend of both of us, has often said, you have to pay enough to get the attention of the people involved. And that's true. You know, something like 22% of the billion-dollar-plus companies were turned down in their requests for board members to join them in the last year. 22% of our largest corporations had it turned down.
And you think the factor was one of the important factors was dollars?
No.
Another was time?
I do not think dollars was it at all, to be honest with you. I think the turn down was largely due to the amount of time that was put in. And of course, that gets translated into what is time worth. But the fact of the matter is very few directors serve because of money. But I do think this, that if you want to broaden the population of directors, the way you can get people who say no to say yes is to get the money up to a level that will attract them enough.
Master, how is it possible that someone who's busy as an academic, perhaps, but more importantly, someone who's busy running his own company and is on one other board, perhaps, and is doing his philanthropic work, how in the world does he or she get the time then to study sufficiently well the workings of another company to take on that responsibility of making policy and passing judgment on the policies that are suggested by management itself?
Well, Dick, I think that's one of the things that should be addressed in corporate America, to be honest with you, because one of the things that directors have to avoid is the make-work project. In other words, the use of the director's time can be very critical, and as I pointed out in that article that you mentioned earlier, it seems to me that if we would compress the things that we give our directors to look at, and if we would be very careful about the agenda, and if we would devote the direction and the attention of directors to the more significant aspects facing the corporation, you could, in fact, reduce the time. Nowadays, I know, and I've had long discussions with many of our clients on this, the material that is generated for each board meeting typically are large volumes of material. It takes you hours to wade through it, and there are ways to shortcut it. And I think a lot of very thoughtful people are beginning to turn their attention to ways to make boards more productive. One of the other ways, Dick, is there's no question in my mind that more could be done through committees. There is a tendency for a committee to take an action and the full board to review the entire matter. It isn't necessary. And I would say that's even true of the compensation for the CEO. If there was a compensation committee certainly the board will look at it, but to rehash everything that led to the determination of how much the CEO and the top 2 or 3 people should be paid, that's what the compensation committee is there for.
I've heard it said, and obviously I know comparatively little about these things, that the process of mystification is a process that does indeed go on in corporate life, and that while you call for clarification of corporate issues and an increasing ability on the part of corporate directors to understand correctly and briefly the business before them, that the professionals, that management has a stake in mystification, because through mystification it runs the board that runs it.
Absolutely, and what you have just said is absolutely true, and obviously one of the things that competent board members do is make sure that they're not falling prey to that mystification that you're talking about. The better the board, the better the individuals that are on the board, the more successful the company is going to be. The better the choice that the CEO makes, because ultimately the choice, even with the nominating committee system now, ultimately the choice is up to the chief executive officer. The better a board, and it's true in his management team too, the better the members of his management team, the more successful he will be. The better his board is, the more successful he will be. The era of window dressing is gone. There's just too much responsibility and too much hard work in being a board member today. And the era of window dressing, be it a member of a minority, be it a woman, and I must tell you that one of the major changes in the last 5 years has been the great growth of women on boards of directors. And they're making marvelous contributions. It almost boggles the mind to think that it took so long for women to get to the board. Because after all, they represent, 54% of our population, and it's only in the last 5 or 8 years that they're appearing on our boards. Most corporations' primary customers are women. And to think that it took this country so long. Now, there are major differences in boards between the United States and overseas. The boards in the United States serve at the election of the shareholders. In Great Britain, for instance, board members are responsible to the CEO, the so-called non-executive director. They're not responsible to the shareholders. In Germany, half the members of a board have to come from the working group of the company. In other words, they're from the unions of the company. So, and that's true whether it's a subsidiary or a parent company in Germany. So you have many things happening in the life of boards.
The point that you make about Germany raises the question when Doug Fraser was a guest here just before he left the presidency of the UAW. He was, of course, a member of the board of the Chrysler Corporation. Do you see that as a growing pattern, or a pattern that, strike that, not as a pattern, but as a phenomenon that will become a pattern in American business, taking the union leader and putting him on the board?
Without it being pejorative, I do not see it as a trend. That was a truly isolated instance. I happen to think some very good things came of it, but I do not see that happening with great frequency. That is not... I can think of, I'm sure there must be, but I can think of no other corporation other than Chrysler that has done that in the United States.
Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that this is not likely to become a pattern?
I think it would be useful to consider whether or not you want a union member on the board, and I think corporate America will. I think the membership of the unions will not let their union presidents serve. And so I think you may see corporate America asking more union presidents to serve, and their members not liking it or understanding it, as I understood how it happened with Mr. Fraser.
Lester, what has been the role that has been played by the boards of directors of those corporations that have been involved in takeover battles in the past 5 or 10 years in this country? There have been so many of them.
Yes, and of course in the last year, some rather unpleasant ones that embarrassed a lot of people. I think that the entire area of corporate ethics has been renewed as a result of some of the takeovers. I think some of the people were aghast at some of the recent takeover attempts. However, a very famous CEO in America once said that when a tender comes, the best thing a board can do is simply get more money for the company, because once the tender comes, it's going to happen. Some of the takeover tenders were, I think, the kind to say that they were misconceived and misdirected. And I think that one of the things you'll see directors focusing on more in the next years to come is this corporate strategic planning, both in defense and offense. Because, after all, if you're representing the shareholder and a tender comes, or you're making one, then you are enhancing the value for the shareholder. And if you can enhance the value of the stock for a shareholder, you certainly are exercising due diligence.
You know, we have about a minute or so left, and I'm afraid that I haven't yet asked you, and I will ask you now, about the question of whether the increased responsibility and the power of boards of directors in this country has led, by and large, in your estimation, to an increased or decreased sense of business responsibility, social responsibility on the part of American business.
Oh, I think it's had a dramatically increased effect to the good. I think that the independent board of directors has, without question, raised the entire standard of business ethics across America. And I have no question in my mind about that.
Well, talking about business ethics, and I really was thinking in terms of the sense of being a partner of the community, the contributions that a corporation makes to the community.
Absolutely. I think that corporate citizenship has improved dramatically as a result of outside directors. It's one of the things I think has been a benefit of that.
Do you think that's been a lure to potential directors, that a company does see itself as a citizen?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think if a company has, for whatever reason, fallen on evil days with its reputation, it's very difficult to get competent directors and outstanding directors for them. The fact that they're viewed as a good corporate citizen and an outstanding company helps us find good directors for that company.
Doing good means doing well, then.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Lester Cohen.
It's a pleasure.
And thanks, too, to you and the audience. I hope that you'll join us again here on The Open Mind. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck.
To know your comments on today's topic, write to Richard Hefner at this station, care of The Open Mind. Mr. Hefner is the author of A Documentary History of the United States and the editor of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America.